All right, with that, let's move on. It is said that history has a tendency to repeat itself. Ask the Ukrainians that, and if they would wholeheartedly agree. 80 years ago, the invasion came from the west. When the jackboots carrying the Nazi swastika marched in to take over their land, millions died in the years that Hitler's army occupied Ukraine. Ironically, the invaders of 2022 have come not from the west, but the east, where 8 decades ago had come the liberators. And once again, Ukraine is paying a terrible price for being in the crosshair of a single individual. Hitler then, Putin now.
Almost 80 years after the war clouds had receded, Ukraine was again under attack. A throwback to the times of terror when the land and its people had been brutalized by Nazi occupation. That Ukraine was unprepared for war in 2022 harks back to the horrors that Ukraine faced during the Second World War. Ukraine never imagined that they would face occupation once again. The numbers speak for themselves. An estimated 3.5 million civilian inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine were victims of German killing policies between 1941 and 1945. Another 3 million Ukrainians died directly as soldiers in the Soviet Red Army fighting the Nazis, or died as a consequence of the war. Entire Ukraine had been occupied by Nazi Germany. And on the eve of invasion in 1941, Ukraine was home to the largest Jewish population in Europe. Hitler's Germany sent special forces called Einsatzgruppen with orders to kill civilians perceived to be enemies of Nazi Germany. They identified the Jews in Ukraine and shot most of them to death close to where they lived. Unlike in other parts of occupied Europe, the Jews of Ukraine were not deported to distant camps. The Jews in Ukraine were taken from their homes to the outskirts of the cities, towns, and villages where they lived, and shot, often in the presence of local residents. 1 in every 4 Jewish victims of the Holocaust was murdered in Ukraine. On September 19, 1941, German forces entered the city of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. At that time, the population of Kyiv was 800,000, out of which about 160,000 were Jews, representing some 20% of the city's population. 100,000 Jews either fled or joined the Red Army when the invasion began. The 60,000 who were left were mostly women, children, and the aged. Ten days later, on September 29-30th, 1941, a large portion of the remaining Jewish population in Kyiv were rounded up and transported to a ravine called Babi Yar, located just outside the city. The victims were forced to undress and made to enter the ravine. A special commando unit shot them in small groups. In those 2 days, 33,771 Jews of Kyiv were executed. Ukraine suffered under invasion. While its Jews were killed, the rest of the population too was brutalized. Industry was allowed to deteriorate, and the country was deprived of food and all available resources, which were all directed to support the German war effort. 2.2 million people were sent from Ukraine to Germany as slave labor. The tide of war on the Eastern Front began to turn in 1943. The Red Army had stalled Hitler at Stalingrad, and the pushback had begun. Hitler ordered that an eastern wall of defensive preparations be made along the Dnieper River. The river was a natural boundary for German forces to fall back on following their retreat from the Volga and Stalingrad. The Red Army launched a massive offensive in August 1943 along a 1,400-kilometer wide front. 2.6 million Soviet troops marched westwards. The German army fell back to their defensive positions on the Dnieper. The fighting was fierce, and by the end of 1943, USSR had regained control of the Crimea and Ukraine, but at terrible cost. More than 400,000 dead, more than 1 million injured. The exact Nazi losses were never collaborated. Every Ukrainian family had stories that went back to the times of bloodshed 80 years ago. And yet, the Ukraine of 2022 is once again under attack. Another invasion is on. The horrors that had been all but forgotten have re-entered people's lives with a bang. For those watching Ukraine suffer, the visuals this time are all in color.